So yeah, thank you for that introduction. And for those of you who we're all watching this remotely, but if you don't have a little space to put my video, there's this little spot up in the corner. There won't be anything important there, so if you want to put my face there, feel free. But thank you, Stephen, for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm super excited to be able to talk about some of the research that I've been working on for the past couple of years. And some of these projects are still ongoing, and so we'll be continuing this research when I move to Queens College in the fall. So today I'm going to be talking about Lake Quaternary glaciation, sea level change, and volcanism on the northwest Pacific coast of North America. And just to make sure we're all on the same page about where that is, the region that I'll be talking about is highlighted by this red box. And so I'll call it the Northwest Pacific Coast, and this region includes coastal British Columbia, which is part of Canada, and then also southeast Alaska. And I'll be discussing the research that myself and my colleagues have been working on over the past couple of years to reconstruct some of the events here that occurred during the late Quaternary period. And as Stephen mentioned, the Quaternary is relatively broad, the past 2.5 million years. And so I'm going to be focusing in really on the past 20,000 or so years. And over this time interval in this region, there were a lot of interesting events happening. We had glaciers retreating, sea levels were changing, and also a number of volcanic eruptions. And by studying these events in this region, we can learn a lot about topics like how glaciers and ice sheets react to climate change. Things like how quickly they react to that change, and also the progression and the style of retreat. And this is important because we have a couple of ice sheets that exist in the polar regions on Earth today. The Antarctic ice sheets and also the Greenland ice sheet, which is up in the northern hemisphere. Today, these ice masses are an integral part of the climate system on Earth. They affect atmospheric circulation, they affect ocean circulation, they affect Earth's albedo, so the energy balance on Earth, and of course, they can affect sea level. And in fact, combined, the ice sheets on Earth have the potential to raise global sea level by about 70 meters if they were to completely melt. And that number is assuming we immediately melt them with no other changes, like to the ocean basins or to gravity. So there's a big impact of these ice sheets potentially on global sea levels. And so an important question that we could all be asking is, how will these ice sheets respond or react to climate change in the coming decades to centuries? And we have a lot of satellite data from the past couple of decades that can help address that question, but although that record is extremely rich and there are a lot of data points, it's relatively short in time, especially compared to how long these ice sheets have existed. And so we can turn to the geologic past to gain a better understanding of how ice sheets respond or react to climate change. And if we wind back the clock to the global last glacial maximum, or LGM, which was between about 26 and 19,000 years ago, there were a number of large ice sheets in North America. And the ice sheet that covered the Northwest Pacific coast was the Cordilleran Ice Sheet. And at its maximum extent, the Cordilleran Ice Sheet was about the size of the Greenland Ice Sheet today. On its eastern margins, it coalesced with the Laurentide Ice Sheet. That's the one that reached all the way down to New York City. And its western margins of the Cordilleran Ice Sheet were all marine terminating, which means that they were in contact with the ocean. And since the Cordilleran Ice Sheet's maximum extent during the last glacial maximum, it's completely disappeared. And one of the questions that we've been particularly interested in addressing is, when did this retreat happen relative to climate change? Was it immediately, or was there some sort of lag? How long did it take for the ice sheet to disappear? And also, were these marine margins of the Cordilleran Ice Sheet on its western side, the ones that were sitting at least partially in the Pacific Ocean, were these margins especially vulnerable to climate change? There were also some very dramatic and spatially variable changes in sea level on the Northwest Pacific coast during the late Quaternary period. And most of these sea level fluctuations had to do with changes in the extent of the Cordilleran Ice Sheet. So during the last glacial maximum, when the Cordilleran Ice Sheet was most extensive, the mass of the ice sheet actually causes downward warping of the crust, And it forces this viscous material in the underlying mantle to flow away from these ice-covered regions. And so in areas where you have thick ice, it essentially pushes down the crust, and the crust is lower than it normally would be. And this is a process called glacial isostatic adjustment. In areas where the ice isn't so thick or around the edges of the ice sheet, the movement of the mantle actually has the effect of raising the land that's peripheral to the ice sheet. And these areas that are uplifted are called a crustal forebulge. And as the ice sheet retreats over time, so this land that was underneath the main part of the ice sheet, the land that's isostatically depressed, it's actually still below sea level for a little bit. And so in these zones where the crust is pushed down, you actually get marine sediments that will accumulate. And over time, the land will rebound or pop back up. And so if we look at the sea level history that you might expect in these areas where you had thick ice, I'll plot it up here on this diagram. So we're going from old to young here. This blue bar would be the timing of deglaciation or ice retreat. And we're plotting sea level. So this would be sea level above modern and sea level below modern. In these areas where we're having the isostatic rebounds, what you would expect to see over time is actually a sea level fall. And at the same time, the zone of uplift in these sort of peripheral forebulge areas, we get a really different sea level signal. Because this forebulge would be migrating inland and collapsing because you don't have the weight of the ice, forcing this to be uplifted, early in the deglacial period, after the ice retreats, you actually get a sea level rise, and it tends to be a very rapid sea level rise that you see as this red line here. And so we have two very different potential sea level histories that are possible within a relatively small area due to the different effects of ice loading on the crust. And knowing how relative sea level changed in a location in the past can help us understand a lot of different things. Past ice sheet thickness and extent and how long the ice sheet was there, the response of the crust to the stress and loading caused by the ice sheet, which can actually tell us a bit about the interior of the Earth. And even more generally, what the landscape used to look like. Where were the shorelines? What was above the ocean? What was below the ocean? And so this is relevant for topics in archaeology. For example, the peopling of the Americas during the late Quaternary. Archaeologists, and actually also the general public, they're interested in knowing both the route and the timing of initial human migration into the Americas. And this is a topic, it's been really vigorously debated for a couple of decades, but I'll lay it out quickly here for you. So the idea is that when humans migrated from Asia over the Bering Land Bridge into modern-day Alaska, they probably hung out in this region for a little bit. And the big question that people want to answer is, how did they migrate from modern-day Alaska into the rest of the Americas? There are basically two options. The first is that they took an overland route, sort of threading the needle between the Laurentide and the Cordilleran ice sheets through that so-called ice-free corridor. And another option is that they traveled along the Pacific coast, taking this coastal route and using areas that were ice-free to migrate south. So answering this question of the route that the first Americans took to get here requires both an understanding of the history of the Cordilleran ice sheet in both the interior and the coastal route. And if we're thinking about how viable this coastal route may have been, we also want to know about the changes in relative sea level, which will allow us to reconstruct where ice-free areas may have been at different times. And evidence from paleogenetics, so looking at ancient DNA, suggests that the first pulse of migration from modern-day Alaska into the rest of the Americas happened around 16,000 years ago. So as I go through some of this part of the talk on the Cordilleran ice sheet retreats and the sea level, keep that number of 16,000 years ago in mind. And finally, the Northwest Pacific coast is a great place to study geologic hazards. And for example, we have a lot of different active volcanoes in the region along this Northwest Pacific coast here. The most famous of which of these volcanoes here is the Mount Edgecombe volcanic field, which is in southeast Alaska. These volcanoes are near a town called Sitka, which is one of the most populous towns in the region, has about 10,000 people. And well, the most recent eruption of the Mount Edgecombe volcano was actually because a guy set a bunch of tires on fire in the crater of the volcano as an April Fool's prank. These volcanoes have been active within the past couple of thousand years. And many of these eruptions were explosive, and they blanketed the region in thick layers of ash. And so reconstructing the eruptive history of these volcanoes will, of course, help us to better assess regional volcanic hazards, which is important for all of the people who live here. So by studying this region, hopefully I've convinced you that we can learn quite a bit about a wide range of topics. And so what I'm going to do for this talk is introduce you to some of the work that myself and my colleagues have been working on. And the first of these topics that I'll discuss is the ice portion of the Land of Ice and Fire in my title. And I'll discuss how we've reconstructed Cordilleran ice sheet change using cosmogenic nuclide surface exposure dating techniques. So for those of you who aren't familiar, I'll go through briefly how these methods work. These techniques rely on the interactions between cosmic rays and elements in rocks. So cosmic rays, they are high energy particles that are sourced from distant parts of our galaxy. These particles enter Earth's atmosphere at extremely high velocities. They collide with particles in the atmosphere, and they start this cascade of spallation reactions. And cosmogenic nuclides, like beryllium-10, are produced in minerals by the interactions between elements in the mineral crystal lattices and cosmic rays and their products. And the key point for these methods is that these reactions will only occur when rocks are exposed to cosmic radiation, so essentially exposed to the atmosphere. And so when you have a glacier or an ice sheet that's covering an area, it effectively shields the rocks beneath it from that cosmic radiation. And therefore, you don't get any cosmogenic nuclides produced in the rock below the glacier. And in the case where you have warm-based ice, so that's ice that's sliding across its bed and has water at the bottom, the bedrock beneath the ice sheet is going to be actively eroded during periods of ice cover. When the glacier or ice sheet retreats, the surfaces that were once below the glacier become exposed, and cosmogenic nuclides will start to be produced in those exposed surfaces. And the majority of cosmogenic nuclides are produced in the upper 3 meters of the rocks, and most of that is concentrated in the upper couple of centimeters. And cosmogenic nuclide accumulation, in some ways it's kind of similar to a sunburn, so the longer a surface has been exposed, the more cosmogenic nuclides will build up in those rocks. And we have a good handle on the rate at which cosmogenic nuclides are produced from independent sources. And these rates are specific to each isotope and each mineral system. So what we'll do when we want to figure out how long a surface has been exposed, we will grab some surface samples from the rocks that we want to date. We'll take those rocks back to the lab, and then we'll isolate our mineral of interest. And we can then very precisely measure the concentration of the nuclides in samples using accelerator mass spectrometry methods. So we know how quickly our isotopes are produced, we know how many we have, and so we can use both of those pieces of information to calculate how long those rocks have been exposed. And in this scenario that I've laid out, that will tell us when the glacier or ice sheet retreated. And these are the methods that we're using to reconstruct Cordilleran ice sheet change on the Northwest Pacific coast. And so I'm going to go into detail about our work that we've been doing in southeastern Alaska, shown by this blue box. But a bit later in this section of the talk, I'm going to show some newer results from other areas along the Northwest Pacific coast, specifically down in coastal British Columbia, and discuss some trends in glacier and ice sheet retreat across the region as a whole. So if we zoom in to southeastern Alaska, this is sort of what the region may have looked like during the last glacial maximum. At least this is what people thought it looked like when we first started this work. So we have some of these islands here, and then this is a reconstruction of where the ice sheet may have been. And so one of the reasons we particularly wanted to study this part of the Pacific coast is because, as you can see on this image, it had been hypothesized that portions of southeastern Alaska had remained completely ice-free during the last glacial maximum, so no cover by the Cordilleran ice sheet. And these potential refugia, as they're called, are indicated on this map. They comprise areas along the western coast, so some of these islands that you see on this hillshade image, and then also parts of the now submerged continental shelf, which is shown by this, this just flat gray shading. So if these ice-free areas existed throughout the last glacial maximum, they could have been lifelines for humans if they were traveling along the coast, providing both food and shelter. If these ice-free areas didn't exist during the last glacial maximum, then the question becomes, when did the Cordilleran Ice Sheet retreat and sort of open the door for human migration into the Americas using this coastal route? So to address these questions, we went to some of these areas that had been hypothesized to be ice-free refugia, and beryllium-10 dated the rocks there to see how long they'd been exposed. And I'll show you a couple of pictures just to show you what these areas looked like. So we started here at a site down on what's called Dahl Island. And the bedrock on Dahl Island, it was relatively angular, and there wasn't really any clear evidence in the field of erosive and sliding glacier ice. And we also didn't find any glacial erratics here, which would indicate that there would have been ice cover. And so these two lines of evidence led us to hypothesize in the field that this particular site had remained ice-free during the last glacial maximum. However, as you can see on these images, the beryllium-10 exposure ages show that the island was covered by ice until around 17,500 years ago. So we were able to eliminate this part of Dahl Island as being an ice-free refugium. So it was covered by glacier ice. So to keep testing this refugia hypothesis, we went to another location just a bit north on Suemez Island. And when we first arrived on Suemez Island, we noticed it looked really different from Dahl Island. We found some very clear evidence of the presence of glacial ice. We found erratic boulders. We found these classic glacial features called roche-moutonnées. We saw chatter marks, which indicated the direction of glacier ice flow. And these were all at about 585 meters above sea level, near the summit of the island. And we have exposure ages from 5 samples at this site, 2 bedrock samples and 3 erratic boulders. And these average 16.6 thousand years of exposure, which tells us that Suemez Island was covered by a very thick Cordilleran ice sheet until that time. So we tried again on 2 other islands, which I won't show pictures from in the interest of time. But we went to these 2 sites, and in all of the locations that we went to, which we thought would have been ice-free during the last glacial maximum, we found really solid evidence for ice cover until around 17,000 years ago. And these sites that are indicated with this, with the black text, these ones would be sites where the Cordilleran Ice Sheet was covering up these islands. The one with the blue text, Baker Island, is a little bit of a different situation. Here, instead of the large ice sheet, we had small, independent alpine glaciers. So they weren't connected to the ice sheet, but they were hanging around until around 15.6 thousand years ago. So none of these places were ice-free during the last glacial maximum, and the Cordilleran ice sheet was retreating in this region about 17,000 years ago. And these results came out in a paper that's a couple of years old now, but we've been doing more work in this region of Southeast Alaska, and specifically to assess the response of the Cordilleran ice sheet margins to climate change during deglaciation. And before I talk about the chronology of ice sheet retreat, I'll review in broad strokes what we know about global climate during this time period. So we're focusing on a period known as the deglacial. So that's the time between the end of the global last glacial maximum around 19,000 years ago and the start of the Holocene around 11.7 thousand years ago. And on this diagram, time is going from left to right. And in general, globally, we're moving from a cold climate state to a warm climate state. But within this transition period, we have a couple of millennial scale oscillations between cold and warm climate states. The first of these that I'll mention, and we'll be bringing these back later in the talk, is what's called Heinrich Stadial 1. In the North Atlantic, Heinrich Stadial 1 is associated with massive iceberg rafting events, so huge amounts of iceberg that were coming out into the North Atlantic and dropping sediment, very coarse sediment, farther than they would normally be able to get. And this generally, globally has been, or at least in the North Atlantic, has been thought of as potentially a cold period. After Heinrich Stadial 1, it's characterized by rapid warming into an interval called the Bowling Alarod. And in the Bowling Alarod, we have warm temperatures that then gradually cool down into a cold period called the Younger Dryas. And the Younger Dryas then rapidly warmed into the Holocene, which is the geologic epoch that we're in now. So the questions that we're trying to address is, did the Cordilleran Ice Sheet react to any of these changes in global climate, or were there potentially more localized factors that were controlling the retreat of the ice sheet? So to answer those questions, we did more beryllium-10 dating in Southeast Alaska. And I'm going to show some data which we published in Quaternary research last June. And I'll mostly be plotting beryllium-10 ages. And as those data populate this map on the left, I'll also be showing some probability density functions of ages on the right. And for those probability density functions, the way you can read them is that the higher the peak is, the more ages fall at that time. And so we can use these density functions to examine how well the ages overlap with one another and also what the averages are. And on this diagram here, time again is going from left to right. But first, before I get the beryllium-10 ages up, I'm going to show two radiocarbon ages from ringed seal bones that were recovered from an ice overrun cave. And these two bones date to about 20 and 17,000 years ago. I unfortunately don't have time in this talk to go into the details, but if anyone is curious, maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A or later. But we interpret these two radiocarbon ages as the timing of Cordilleran ice sheet advance and retreat over that particular site. So 20,000 years ago, the Cordilleran ice sheet is advancing over this part of Southeast Alaska. Now, here are some of those beryllium-10 ages from the westernmost islands. Many of these you saw on the previous slides, but there are also a number of new ages from sites that hadn't been thought to be ice-free. These ages show a deglaciation of the outer coast around 16.9 thousand years ago. So from the data that we have up here now, we can constrain the timing of the maximum Cordilleran ice sheet extent to an interval between about 20 and 17,000 years ago here in Southeast Alaska, which is actually pretty rare to be able to do from terrestrial records, at least in areas where you actually had an ice sheet covering the region. So here are those ages again from Baker Island, showing the retreat of an alpine glacier independent of the ice sheet around 15.6 thousand years ago. And finally, there are ages from a bit farther inland or a bit farther east, and these data are unfortunately a little bit more scattered, but we do see a pulse of deglaciation or ice retreat happening around 15,000 years ago. So how do these ages from Southeast Alaska stack up with some of the others from around the Northwest Pacific coast? This is a figure that's a little bit small, but it's from a paper that Chris Darville at the University of Manchester is preparing right now, and he was kind enough to let me use it for this talk. And Chris has been leading the charge on beryllium-10 dating surfaces in coastal British Columbia. So here's Southeast Alaska, where we were looking at on the previous slides, and he's been doing a lot of dating in areas in British Columbia. On the right panel of this figure, you can see the probability density functions of beryllium-10 ages from all of these different sites, and time is going from right to left here. And what you can see is that across this really large area, it spans a couple of 100 kilometers, we have some similar trends in the timing of Cordilleran ice sheet retreat. There's a phase of retreat that's starting between about 18 and 16,000 years ago that we see in southeastern Alaska and many sites in British Columbia. And then there's another phase of retreat between about 14.5 to 13,500 years ago. So we're seeing two major pulses of retreat during the late Pleistocene, or the late Quaternary. So how does this terrestrial record that we've gotten from beryllium-10 surface exposure dating line up with records from marine sediment cores? I have a stack of a couple of different records here, and apologies for the switching again, time's going from left to right now. So on the bottom of this figure, we have beryllium-10 ages from across the Northwest Pacific coast that we saw on the previous slide. And again, we've got our two major pulses of deglaciation, one starting 18,000 years ago and one starting about 14,000 years ago. And this is happening during Heinrich Stadial 1 and the Bowling Alarod. And that first pulse of deglaciation 18,000 years ago that we identify by our beryllium-10 ages aligns with a major ice rafting event in the Gulf of Alaska, which is shown by the black star on this map. This event was called a Siku event by Walczak and others in a recent paper, and this indicates that there were a lot of icebergs carrying coarse sediment to the ocean around this time. And the core site where these Siku events were identified receives ice rafted debris from Southeast Alaska as well as Southern Alaska due to the northward flow of the Alaska Current along the coast. In addition, we also see ice rafting events at 17 and 14,000 years ago farther south near Vancouver Island, shown by this blue star and this record up on the top panel. So together, these lines of evidence all suggest that retreats of the marine terminating Cordilleran ice sheet margins was happening at roughly the same time across the North Pacific, across a really wide area. And interestingly, we see the retreat during a maybe cold Heinrich Stadial 1 and also a warm Bowling Allerod period. And we'll come back to some of our ideas about what may have triggered these periods of retreat later in the talk. So now that we sort of have the chronology of the retreat down in terms of when it happened, what may it have looked like? Here's our reconstruction of the Cordilleran ice sheet at its maximum extent before 18,000 years ago. So this is Southeast Alaska up here, and then this is British Columbia down here. And in Southeast Alaska, you can see that we haven't mapped any areas as being ice-free refugia during the maximum extent. And across the region, we had very large ice streams that were filling many of these depressions, which are now large troughs within the ocean. And in Canada, the Cordilleran ice sheet is coalescing with some local independent ice caps on this archipelago called Haida Gwaii, potentially leaving some parts of the bay between them ice-free. By 17,000 years ago, ice had begun to pull back from some of the islands on the outer coast, exposing some of these surfaces are over in British Columbia, and icebergs also start rafting sediment out to the continental shelf. And there were extensive areas along the western coast here exposed by 16,000 years ago. And remember, that's when paleogenetic evidence suggests that humans may have been migrating into the Americas. So from these data, we can conclude that deglaciation of the Cordilleran ice sheet created at least a physically open pathway for humans to migrate into the Americas. And interestingly, if we take a look at those ice-rafted debris records again, this period between the end of Heinrich Stadial 1, 16,000 years ago, and the start of the Bowling Allerod, 14,500 years ago, was actually pretty quiet in terms of ice-rafted debris, so in terms of glacier calving. So if humans were migrating along the coast during this time interval, then it might have been a slightly easier journey than it would have been, at least in terms of iceberg hazards, before 16,000 years ago or after 14,500 years ago. And retreat of the Cordilleran ice sheet that we can track with our beryllium 10 ages continued until around 13,000 years ago, by which time most of the fjords in the region had become at least partially ice-free. And that's where our beryllium 10 exposure age chronology pretty much ends. So we can continue to fill in our timeline of environmental change, ice retreats, and just reconstructing the past environment by turning to a different set of records, which would be our sea level records. These records are going to be documenting events after Cordilleran ice sheet deglaciation. And so to generate a timeline of sea level change in an area, and we'll be focusing on Southeast Alaska, what we'll do is we'll find marine sediments that are raised above modern sea level. Sometimes these will be in terraces and sometimes not. And once we find these sediments, we can radiocarbon date material that's within them, things like shells. And those ages from the marine sediments will tell us when sea level was last at a particular elevation. And we can supplement these terrestrial records with data from marine sediment cores, which show transition from saltwater to freshwater, for example. And this kind of work has been ongoing for a number of years. There are a lot of really good sea level records for coastal Canada. But in Southeast Alaska, finding terrestrial deposits that capture past sea level change is a bit of a challenge. And one of the reasons for that is because there's very thick vegetation on the ground here, which makes field geology a little bit difficult to do. And so what we're looking at here is a marine terrace underneath all of these plants. There it is outlined in yellow. So Jim Bechtel, who works at the US Forest Service, And his colleagues, they've spent decades mapping the occurrences of these raised marine sediments on land, and also finding radiocarbon datable material in them, things like shells, to constrain the age of past sea levels throughout Southeast Alaska. And over the years, we've documented a lot of these occurrences of raised marine sediments. We have more than 700 separate locations where these sediments have been found on land. And from these locations, we have over 200 radiocarbon ages on shells and other marine materials that we can use to reconstruct past sea level change in this region. And just to make sure we're all oriented, this is the place, the zone where we've got most of our beryllium-10 ages that I presented on the previous slides. So we're looking at a slightly more extensive area for this part of the talk. So what I'm going to do over the next couple of slides is show you some of the results of all of the data that we've gotten from these raised marine sediments. And I'm going to build up some relative sea level curves that we've created based on our radiocarbon ages. These results aren't published just yet. We're actually working on revisions for the paper for publication right now. And on this diagram, time is running from left to right on the x-axis, and sea level is on the y-axis. And our data are all going to be plotted against the mean low water datum, which is the minimum tide level. I've put some of those climatic intervals that we mentioned on previous slides just for reference. I've also put the timing of maximum Cordilleran ice sheet extent in Southeast Alaska that we've got from our beryllium-10 and radiocarbon ages on those ringed seal bones. I'll also have a map up here that I'll use to show the locations of the samples that we used to generate each sea level curve. And finally, the depths of a few wave-cut terraces that are significantly below modern sea level. These terraces are undated, but we can use them to anchor our sea level curves. So now that we've got sort of the bones of this plot, let's put some data up here. So along the westernmost islands, this is a place where we've got a lot of beryllium-10 chronology. If we look at the trend in sea level, if we're looking early in the record, we can see a very rapid sea level rise in the postglacial period before around 11,000 years ago. So this rapid sea level rise, we can attribute this to the migration and collapse of that uplifted crustal forebulge in this region. And sea level in this part of Alaska reaches a maximum elevation of about 20 meters above modern, around 10.8 thousand years ago. And in a short 500-year period, from 11.3 to 10.8 thousand years ago, relative sea level rose approximately 82 meters. And if we convert that into a rate, it's a sea level rise of about 18.6 centimeters per year. And just to really drive home how kind of crazy fast that is, if a person was living on the coast and they were 50 years old, sea level would have risen 9.2 meters in their lifetime. And what's really exciting is this rapid sea level rise is recorded in some of the oral traditions of the native tribes who live here, the Tlingit. Their oral traditions have stories about the tide growing higher and higher. And I think it's really exciting to see this oral histories actually bear out in the geologic data like we see here. After about 10.8 thousand years ago, sea level along this part of southeastern Alaska starts to drop, and we get the formation of widely traceable terraces throughout the region, which is what I'm showing with these downward steps on the sea level curve. And I'll come back to those and why they're interesting in a couple of slides. So to summarize, in this western part of Southeast Alaska, where the Cordilleran Ice Sheet we know wasn't really there for very long, the early part of the sea level record is controlled by the migration and collapse of the crustal forebulge, which was completed around 11,000 years ago. If we move a little bit farther north in the Sitka and Mount Edgecombe region, we have a slightly different sea level history. We still see a rise in relative sea level during the early deglacial period, which is from the collapse of that forebulge. But based on our radiocarbon ages for some of the deposits that we have on land, the maximum transgressions, so the maximum sea level rise, only reached about 8 meters above modern sea level. And that position was achieved quite a bit later than farther south. So it was achieved only around 8,000 years ago. And we also don't see the development of those widely traceable terraces in this part of Alaska. If we move back down south again, just a little bit inland from this sort of western island zone, we get a totally different sea level signal. Here we have a mix of the forebulge migration and isostatic rebound contributing to sea level change. So in this record, our relative sea level rises from near modern to about 60 meters higher than it is today in a pretty short period between about 14 and 13,000 years ago. And this, we think, is recording the migration of the forebulge through that area. Then sea level begins to drop again as isostatic rebound takes over. And if we go just a little bit further inland, so again, we're not really that far away, we don't see that forebulge signal so clearly anymore. It seems that the sea level history here, where we have this sort of steady drop, seems to be controlled mostly by isostatic rebound. And finally, if we look up farther north in the vicinity of Juneau and Glacier National Park, we have a very markedly different sea level history. Here, we look like we're controlled just by isostatic rebound. And the rebound here was pretty dramatic. Between about 14 and 11,000 years ago, sea level dropped at least 170 meters, and that's a rate of about 6.1 centimeters per year. So we've got a lot of data on here, but what I really want to highlight is that depending on where you are and sort of the glacial history of the region, you can get very, very different sea level histories. And that's what we're seeing with these data. And what we can also do is put on this map of where all our samples are, the maximum elevation of raised marine sediments that we find on land. In other words, we can plot the marine limit. And what you can see when we put those data up there, which was probably also apparent from the previous sea level curves if you've spent a lot of time looking at that kind of data before, is that there's a big spread in the elevation of the marine limit across the region. And we can explain this, I think, mostly by the differential response of the crust to ice floating. And when we look at these marine limits, I think we can split the region into two main zones. The first would be these westernmost islands, which are the ones whose sea level histories seem to be mostly controlled and reflecting the migration and collapse of this crustal forebulge. And the second zone would be most of these sites that are farther inland, where the marine limit is higher and whose sea level histories are dominated by isostatic rebounds. However, you can see in here that we have some pretty variable marine limits, even within this isostatic rebound zone. And I don't have time to go into details about all of what we think is going on here, but we believe this has something to do with both the thickness of the Cordilleran Ice Sheet or local glaciers over these spots, potentially the activation of faults that formed when this region was a subduction zone in the not so distant past, and at least up in the Juneau area here where we have our highest isostatic rebound, potentially the higher geothermal heat flux, which could make the crust a little bit more bendy and the mantle maybe move a little bit more quickly. So that's a summary of some of the relative sea level data that we've been able to generate using this massive database of radiocarbon ages that Jim Batestel and his colleagues have been able to put together. And I mentioned a couple slides ago, we were going to come back to the marine terraces that formed in this region here. And I'll tell you how we can use these marine terraces. So going back to the relative sea level curve for this, this sort of western island region, we had the development of terraces in the region after around 11,000 years ago. And just to point these out again, as the sea level starts to drop, these terraces here, these sort of steps down, will form when sea level and the motion of the land were essentially in equilibrium for some duration of time. And this is what these terraces look like in map form. So these are LiDAR-based hill shades of some areas in Southeast Alaska. And you can see the development of these terraces because you have glacial flow features. They're moving these sort of lineations that are moving in the northeast to the southwest direction. You can see they sort of get cut off or truncated by these terraces. And just to highlight that here are 5 different terraces that are highlighted by these different colors. And the elevation of the maximum sea level transgression, again, is shown where these glacial features are truncated by these shorelines. And so based on radiocarbon ages, like you can see up here from marine shells within these terraces, we can tie these shorelines to specific time intervals. And then we can use that information to map these shorelines across wide areas in the past. And this has been really great for archaeological research in the region, and I'll show you how. For example, by mapping shorelines that date to the early Holocene, so after 11.7 thousand years ago, my colleagues were able to figure out where cultural sites may be, so where we might be able to find artifacts. And in this example, they figured out that the location with the star, that yellow star there, would be a really good place for someone to build a camp 10,500 years ago, because this river channel would have been constricted by the shoreline. And so this is a place where sort of salmon might hang out. And so it'd be a good spot to go fishing. They did this all throughout Southeast Alaska, and with no other information, based on just these maps, they went out and dug a bunch of test pits around the region. And what they found was artifacts, things like microblades. And they found about 30 early Holocene archaeological sites that have been in this way, which have provided a lot of insight into the human history of this region. So now that we have even more robust constraints on sea level than they did back when they first tried this method out in 2015, we hope to be able to continue this work and find more cultural materials throughout Southeast Alaska, and perhaps even some ones that are older than the Holocene. So we've talked about glaciers, we've talked about sea level. Let's very quickly go into the final section of this talk, which would be the fire part of the land of ice and fire. And as a reminder, we'll mostly be focusing on what we know about the eruptive history of the Mount Edgecombe volcanic field, which is in this northern part of Southeast Alaska. So the Mount Edgecombe volcanic field is on southern Kruzof Island, and its tectonic setting is that it's on the North American plate, about 10 to 15 kilometers inboard of the Queen Charlotte Fairweather Transform Fault. And that Transform Fault is the boundary between the North American and the Pacific plate. The Mount Edgecombe volcanic field is dominated, as you might guess from its name, by a stratovolcano called Mount Edgecombe, and you can see what that volcano looks like on this picture taken from the town of Sitka. And despite the fresh constructional morphology of the cone, there's no evidence for historical eruptions in either Russian documents or native oral traditions. And the last certain activity of the volcanic field was 2 tephra-forming eruptions that occurred between 6 and 4,000 years ago. However, there was a period of significant volcanic activity early in the postglacial times. And these eruptions were voluminous. They let out about 7.6 cubic kilometers of dense rock equivalent. Tephra deposits produced by those explosive eruptions, like those you can see here, which were preserved in a pond, are pretty common throughout Southeast Alaska. These deposits have been found as far away from the volcano as Juneau and Lituya Bay, which are about 200 kilometers away. And the typical sequence of tephra that you might find on land, we have till from the Cordilleran Ice Sheet at the base, a pretty small layer of postglacial silt, and then a series of tephras that alternate between a couple of different types in composition. And there's one tephra, a dacitic tephra up here, whose eruption age is very well constrained, at least from terrestrial deposits. And that age constraint actually comes from a birch tree that was preserved in situ in one of these tephra layers that's really close to the Mount Edgecombe volcano. This birch tree was actually found by a 12-year-old boy who was on a picnic with his family. So he called up Jim Bechtel at the Forest Service. We went out there and we collected a sample from the tree, and we radiocarbon dated that tree to 13.2 thousand years old, which gives us, again, a good constraint on the age of this tephra. When we look at the marine realm, we have an even more finely resolved record of volcanism from the Mount Edgecombe volcanic field. This figure that I'm showing comes from a really excellent paper by Summer Praetorius and her colleagues, and they were looking at the relationships between volcanism, ice retreat, and glacial isostatic adjustment near the Mount Edgecombe volcanic field. And on this plot, time's going from right to left, and their data come from 2 sediment cores off the coast of Southeast Alaska, shown by those yellow stars. And what they found was that after Cordilleran Ice Sheet retreat, which they track with the occurrence of ice rafted debris, there was a period of explosive volcanism from about 14.5 to 13.1 thousand years ago. And they attributed this activity to crustal flexure caused by the unloading of the crust as the Cordilleran Ice Sheet retreated. We know from our relative sea level records that sea level in this area was rising rapidly as that forebulge passed. So it seems to me that the changes in the stress regime of the crust could be a likely candidate for the cause of this volcanism. Furthermore, these scientists looked at the occurrence of thick basaltic composition tephras in their marine cores. And they found that these basaltic ash layers were common, and they occurred just before big fluctuations in both sea surface temperature and also surface ocean salinity. And so if these oscillations in sea surface conditions are related to Cordilleran ice sheet activity, perhaps by the ice sheet putting a lot of very cold, very low salinity water into the surface ocean, then perhaps the falling of that dark basaltic colored ash, or that dark basaltic ash on the ice surface, may have been able to actually warm up the ice and promote more melting. So it seems like there may be a potentially interesting relationship here, where melting of the Cordilleran ice sheet triggers eruptions, which then release ash that, when it settles on the surface of the ice sheet, may have enhanced the melting, at least on short time scales. We're also working on some brand new stuff dating some of the lava flows around the Mount Edgecombe volcanic field. These results are pretty much brand new. We just got them last week, and we're still interpreting them. But I thought I would share what we have with you all today and see if anyone has any thoughts. We've been collecting samples from basalt flows, so these blue portions of the map, for cosmogenic chlorine-36 dating to better constrain the exposure history of the volcanic field. So chlorine-36, it's a less commonly used cosmogenic nuclide than beryllium-10, but what's great about it is that it works on a wide variety of rock types, unlike beryllium-10, which is extracted from quartz. Basalt obviously doesn't have any quartz in it, so we can use chlorine-36 to date these surfaces. And the underlying principles of chlorine-36 dating are the same as they are for beryllium. More exposure leads to more nuclides in the rock surface. The basalt flows in this region, their ages have been broadly constrained to some time in the Quaternary, but as you can see from these potassium-argon crystallization ages that were listed here, there's a bit of scatter, with some of the ages potentially being very late Quaternary. And in terms of the most recent exposure history of this island, we don't really have constraints directly from the island itself, but beryllium-10 ages from nearby islands suggest they were covered by the Cordilleran Ice Sheet or local glaciers until around 15,000 years ago, and also that the glaciers that were on those islands weren't very erosive. So in most locations, these basalt flows on the coast are overlain by that 13,000-year-old dacite tephra that I mentioned on the previous slides, which is the light yellow on this geologic map. So we wanted to see what we could learn about these lava flows through chlorine-36 dating, and we decided to focus on this area here on the eastern edge of the volcanic field. And this is what that region looks like from satellite imagery. We have this dacite tephra that's exposed, and it's overlying this basalt, which is right up on the coast. And what we'll do now is we'll zoom in to where that white arrow is pointing so I can show you what the basalt looks like. So this is looking east at the basalt. This particular location is about 5 meters above sea level. And what you can see from this basalt is that there's a pressure ridge or tumulus here, which indicates that this flow erupted subaerially, so not in a submarine or in a subglacial environment. And the surfaces around here, they look like they have been eroded somewhat, but we still see a lot of sharp angles. And from our field reconnaissance, we didn't really see any glacial erosional features in the area. So we took 2 samples from the site so far. Both of these are above the modern tidal zone, and their chlorine-36 inventories average to about 7,000 years of exposure, which is much younger than the deglaciation age of 15,000 years that we get from nearby islands. So what's going on with these apparently young ages? Our main hypothesis right now anyways, is that all of the chlorine-36 accumulated after the sea level regression or sea level fall in this area. If we go back to our relative sea level curve for the Sitka region, which is where Mount Edgecombe is, we can see that relative sea level drops below about 5 meters right around 7,000 years ago, which is right in line with those chlorine-36 ages on the basalt. So to explain not having any chlorine-36 from earlier than 7,000 years ago, though, in one scenario, the basalt could have erupted sometime between deglaciation 15,000 years ago and the eruption of that dacite tephra 13.2 thousand years ago. And so this basalt wouldn't have been eroded by glaciers at all. It wouldn't have had a chance. And that would allow us to preserve those delicate surface textures you saw on the previous couple of slides. However, as I mentioned earlier, some of those potassium-argon ages on the basalt deposits are potentially pre-last glacial maximum. They could be hundreds of thousands of years old. So how, in that case, could we explain only 7,000 years of exposure at these sites? When the half-life of chlorine-36 is quite long, 301,000 years. In another scenario, it could be that there is potentially thick cover, either by tephra or vegetation or forests, that may have shielded the rock surfaces from cosmic radiation for some long duration of time until sea level dropped 7,000 years ago. And in this case, glaciers may have covered the site, but if that is what happened, then the glaciers would have needed to be mostly cold-based. So they would have needed to be frozen to the bed, no liquid water at the base, to preserve those surface textures on the basalt and to not erode them down. Regardless of what we can learn about the sort of eruptive history of that basalt, it seems that one way or another, the cosmogenic nuclide inventories in these basalt surfaces actually reflect the timing of sea level regression or sea level fall 7,000 years ago. And if this interpretation is correct, then we may actually be able to use in situ cosmogenic nuclides to reconstruct past sea level, which is something that, at least to my knowledge, people haven't really tried before. Usually we try to avoid sampling in areas below the marine limit. So if this interpretation is correct and we can sort of think through all the different scenarios, we're going to be working on a proposal to test this method further. And if this method does work, I think it'd be pretty exciting because it would allow us to reconstruct past sea level in places where we don't have clear shorelines preserved, or if we don't have any organic material for radiocarbon dating. So stay tuned for that. I will definitely be working on this when I arrive at Queen's College in the fall. So we've covered a lot of ground this afternoon. What have we learned? What I'm going to do to end the talk is build up a stack of climate records, times going from left to right again. And I also have this map that'll show you where each record comes from. Again, here are our climate intervals for reference. So the first record we'll plot up is our beryllium-10 ages from across the Northwest Pacific coast. Again, those show two major pulses of deglaciation around 18,000 years ago and around 14,000 years ago during Heinrich Stadial 1 and the Bowling Alarod. We're seeing in the Gulf of Alaska and in down by Vancouver Island in British Columbia, we have these ice rafting events that are coincident with these pulses of deglaciation from our terrestrial records. And so this is, like I said earlier, telling us that we have pretty much synchronous retreat of these ice sheet margins across the Pacific coast. I also introduced our new sea level history for Southeast Alaska, which shows the differential response of the crust and sea level to loading and unloading by the ice sheet. And we also constrained the collapse of that forebulge to around 11,000 years ago. So what may have actually been causing some of these changes on the Northwest Pacific coast? I mentioned earlier that explosive volcanism from the Mount Edgecombe volcanic field and associated albedo feedbacks on the ice sheet may have contributed to that second pulse of deglaciation around 14,000 years ago. Another factor, which I haven't mentioned yet, but that may have contributed to the early retreat of the ice sheet around 18,000 years ago, was eustatic sea level rise. So sort of global sea level rise where all of the oceans are rising together. This may have actually served to destabilize margins of the ice sheet that were grounded, so sitting on the seafloor, and promoted breaking off of the ice sheet's margins and calving. And finally, around 18,000 years ago, you see this here, ocean temperatures in both the surface and the subsurface were increasing. And so that increase in ocean temperatures, the warming of the ocean, may have also promoted melting and calving of marine terminating Cordilleran ice sheet margins. So to summarize, the Cordilleran ice sheet was retreating between about 18 and 16,000 years ago. This is its first phase of retreat, and this may have been related to both eustatic sea level rise and ocean warming, suggesting that the marine margins of the ice sheet may have been especially vulnerable to climate change. 14,000 years ago, the Cordilleran ice sheet had retreated from the fjords. Sea level rise was happening quickly, and the crustal forebulge was migrating and collapsing. and this may have been helped along by eruptions from the Mount Edgecombe volcanic field. These interactions between all of these different parts of the Earth system ensured that we had an open corridor along the Pacific coast that was available for human migration into the Americas 16,000 years ago. And as a final point, I've covered a lot of material, but the take-home message I want to leave you with is that this region was very dynamic during the late Quaternary. And if humans did migrate along the Pacific coast to get into the Americas, they would have had a lot to contend with. Icebergs breaking off of the ice sheets, very variable sea levels, and even explosive volcanism. And so even though I've talked a lot about what we've learned over the past couple of years, there's still a lot we don't know about past environmental change in this region. And the team that's been investigating these questions along with me, whose names are listed here, we're going to continue this work so we can better understand the history of this very exciting part of North America. So with that, thank you everybody for your attention, and I'll take questions.
Thank you. That was an amazing talk. And so you can either unmute and ask a question, or if you're a little shy, you can just type it into the chat and we'll take questions.
Stop the share for a second.
Okay. Any questions to begin with? Was everyone typing? Well, actually, I have a question. So you talked about a lot of different mechanisms for relative sea level rise or change. I don't think that you really mentioned anything about the gravity ice effect.
Yeah, that is one that could also be having an effect as well, especially so for those of you who aren't super familiar with relative sea level change, there are a number of factors that can affect sea level at a particular location. And one of those is actually the gravitational attraction between the glacier or the ice sheet and the ocean. When ice sheets are really big, they can actually have a measurable effect on the sea level around them, so they can sort of pull up the ocean around them. And so that's something we haven't really considered here, but it could definitely be contributing to some of the sea level drops that we see in our records. Yeah.
Because, you know, this is a concept that's relatively new for geologists. I guess people who do modeling, they go, oh, we've known this for ages, but it's only been around for the last 10 or 20 years ago, 10, 15 years. And so when I heard about this, I said, oh my goodness, you know, near Antarctica, it could change sea level by tens of meters to maybe over 100 meters between glaciated Antarctica and deglaciated. So the Cordilleran is smaller than Antarctica, but I guess would be measurable, you know, significant.
Right, yeah, and that's something, you know, I admit we haven't really thought about the effect that that might have on our records, but now that you mention it,
Sure.
I think I might go back.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just see how it fits in. I mean, this area is so interesting too, because, you know, it's not like a tectonically quiet area either. And so we've got faults, we've got some strike slip motion, we've got some oblique subduction that was happening not too long ago, and so it's a very challenging place to reconstruct sea level because just so many factors could be contributing to the signal.
An active margin, glaciation, and everything else. And so actually we have a question on chat. So they're very interested, the students are, about you. What courses will you be teaching next semester?
So far I've only committed to teaching 208, so the sedimentology and geomorphology course. And I think that's probably the only one I'll be teaching this fall.
Exactly.
But yeah, I'll be over the years developing some new courses too. So maybe like a glacial geology course or something like that. So yeah, look out for that.
Excellent. If it's glacial geology, maybe I can help a little bit with that.
Yeah, we could do like a paleoclimate class or something. That would be really cool.
I would love that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's collective. And so thank you. Absolutely. So Max, to everyone, are there, actually, if Vitaly, whether the magnitude of isostatic movement is related to the thickness of the glacier, that isostatic movement occur in river valleys?
So the amount of isostatic adjustment, so that the amount of rebound is related to the thickness of the ice sheet. So it's sort of proportional to how much it got pushed down, right? It'll be sort of rebounding to roughly where it was before. In terms of it happening in river valleys, that's sort of an interesting question. I know that rivers have been rerouted by isostatic adjustment, like from the Laurentide ice sheet, for example. There are people who sort of look at the changes in major river systems because of that sort of glacial isostatic adjustment. But I'm not sure if that's a factor with rivers. I don't know if they're heavy enough to push the crust down like that.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Okay, so another one from Yvonne. Oh no, actually from Max. Are the differences in how you interpret the ages of boulders and bedrock?
Yes, that is a great question. So let me see. I've got I have some bonus slides on here. Maybe I have something in there. No, I can go back to sort of our my little cartoon of glaciers, which is somewhere in this presentation. Okay, so I can share my screen again just to illustrate. Desktop, share, present. Okay, so it's a great question asking about bedrock versus boulders. So I outlined in this, am I sharing the right screen? Can you all see it?
Oh, I could see it.
Okay, great. And so when you have a case of a glacier that's worm-based, so one that's got water at the base, it's sliding along its bed, that sliding can really grind down the rocks below it. And so bedrock, in an ideal case, is being eroded. And as I mentioned, when we're talking about the accumulation of cosmogenic nuclides, they really only accumulate in the upper couple meters. And so if your glacier is erosive enough, what it'll do is grind down through any nuclides that were accumulated during a period of exposure before covering of the ice sheet, so before that glacier advanced over the spot. And this sort of ideal case, as I outlined, both boulders and bedrock should have the same age. But if you have a case where your ice sheet or glacier isn't erosive enough to grind down through all of that 3 meters of rock, you can actually have the situation where you have nuclides that built up before the most recent period of ice advance still remain in that rock. We call those inherited nuclides. So they're sort of left over from the prior period of exposure. And what that can do is make your age that you get when you go out and take your sample older than the most recent period of ice retreat. So in cases where we might not have a very erosive glacier, you would interpret the bedrock and boulder ages differently. However, we can actually use that too to sort of estimate the amount of erosion that occurred if we take a bedrock and a boulder sample from the same spot. So it's a complication, but we can also make use of it as well. Great question.
Yes, absolutely. So Yvonne's got a question. Okay, I've never heard of cosmogenic nuclei before. Are there any other applications?
Yes, right. So we can, yes, there are. So cosmogenic nuclides, we can use them to date the duration of exposure of glacial surfaces. We can use them to date the exposure of lava flows, for example. People also use cosmogenic nuclides to date or to constrain erosion by measuring cosmogenic nuclide concentrations in sediments rather than rocks. And so you can use that to look at sort of basin averaged erosion rates over time. And that's something that the previous speaker, Pedro, last week was talking about, using beryllium-10 to look at erosion rates. And so, yeah, they're a really great tool for sort of reconstructing both, the timing and sort of the changes that happen on Earth's surface. And there are a bunch of different nuclides that you can use. Some of them are radioactive, some of them are stable, so they can tell you different things. And they have different half-lives. So yeah, it's a really, really versatile tool.
And just to follow up on that, how far back in time can you go using this method?
It totally depends on the nuclide that you're using. So some nuclides like helium-3 and neon-21, they're stable, so they don't undergo radioactive decay. So in theory, if you have a mineral that's not being eroded or broken down, you can go back millions of years. However, the history that you would get is cumulative. So if you have periods of cover and exposure and then cover and exposure, you're going to get the total duration of exposure. Isotopes like beryllium-10, the half-life is about 1.1 million years. So it's mostly useful for periods over sort of the Quaternary. And a lot of these sort of shorter-lived half-lives are mostly useful for the Quaternary. You can technically use them to go back a little bit farther in time, but then sort of the the geomorphology of like the boulder. It sort of gets really crumbly over a long time, and so that has an effect on it as well.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, so I have a question. I'm not sure what it means. Does the unorthodox day/night schedule affect erosion?
So are you, who asked that question, are you sort of asking about like temperature fluctuations from like day to night?
That's from Peter. Okay, Peter? The sun in Alaska, he's saying.
Oh, so sort of like, yeah, so like having sort of the polar night where you don't have the sun for a long time in the year.
Maybe.
Potentially. I mean, I think Alaska overall is at least where I've been working, is a pretty temperate climate. So we're only around 55 north. So we're not in that sort of Arctic Circle zone. But there are longer days and nights. I don't know how much, I feel like the sort of the freeze-thaw cycles would be a little bit more important for erosion, and things like rain. It's very rainy there. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, and I think Danielle's question was I just asked it. So how early can you see evidence of cosmogenic nuclei? So.
Well, so cosmogenic nuclei, they'll be produced by that sort of cosmic radiation, which has been happening as long as Earth's been around. And so, like I said, we do have some of those stable nuclei, which have been building up over millions of years. You know, we see that people have done studies in Antarctica looking at, you know, the accumulation of those stable nuclides over like the entire time that the Antarctic ice sheet has been around. But yeah, I think it depends on which nuclide you're good with. So yeah.
So
just related to that, I have a question. So like, what's the youngest material you could possibly date, like with the precision of the method?
Yeah, so that one is mostly reliant on sort of our analytical capabilities, and it really depends on the cleanliness of the lab that you're working in, because the amount, we're literally counting numbers of atoms for this. The ratios between our stable and non-stable are in the range of 10 to the minus 13 or something like that. But we've been able to date with beryllium-10 and radiocarbon ages that are, you know, in the past 100, 200 years. You have to do that in a really clean environment, but it can be done. And our analytical precision, in these days, we can get in the ballpark for beryllium of about 1 to 2% precision. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah.
I know where you're at.
Lots of possibilities.
Yes. Yeah.
And I just want to confirm, cosmogenic dating is not useful once you get into water.
Yeah, so it's, you know, that same principle where I talked about, you know, glaciers shielding the rocks below from cosmogenic radiation or cosmic radiation. That also applies to water. Really the thing that's going to be affecting how well those particles are blocked is the density of the material. And so something like rock or ice or water will be able to block the particles more effectively than air, right? Because it's a lot more dense. So it is something that will shield, although it gets a little complicated when you're thinking about like tidal cycles and erosion by waves and all of that stuff. But like I said, we'll hopefully be trying to develop that technique soon.
And I have a great question that could be, I think, maybe a nice summarizing. Any thoughts on your next location to search for geologic evidence of a coastal migration route?
Yes, that is an excellent question. So there are some anthropologists who are working in Southeast Alaska and Canada in places where I didn't really plot any data from these locations, but it's sort of on the balance between the zone of isostatic rebound and the zone of the forebulge, where sea level has been pretty much at the same level since deglaciation. Those could potentially be places where you could look for archaeological evidence if you can find them and find things to date in them and places to dig. Something else that would be super cool, although it would not be me doing this work, is to try to do some underwater archaeology, go to places on the continental shelf that may have been exposed early on. Yeah, that's not going to be me, but maybe somebody could do that. And then also something that I would like to do is go a little bit further north and try to date the retreat of the ice sheets in areas that would have been sort of connecting interior Alaska to the coast. You know, we've sort of said that the coast is open, but then the question becomes, how did they get from the interior Alaska to the coast? Were there any sort of pathways that they could have taken between those glaciers? And to my knowledge, that hasn't really been addressed yet. So that'd be something that would be cool to do, I think.
Great. And so what a great ending. So it's about 1:30 now. So I want to thank you so much. If there's no more questions, thank you so much. This was great. We look forward to seeing you this late summer and fall.
Yeah, thanks. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Look forward to seeing you and working with you.
Yeah.
Okay, so next week we have more speakers. So so not bearing email situations. Please stay tuned for the next colloquium next week. Okay, take care.
I'm entirely impressed at the turnout. I think that the community navigated the overall challenges quite well.
Yeah, it was well over 40. It was about 46 or 45, and excluding the speaker. So
in the midst of an email crisis, that's not bad.
Yes. Very good. And then we're recording this. I'm going to actually stop the recording right now. And so, okay, there it goes.